Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Adult Sunday School. Glad you all could make it this morning. Some of you from late nights last night, and we made it in bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, as my dear mother used to say. So let's go to the Lord in prayer, ask His blessing for this morning's study, and we'll continue our study through the book of 1 Samuel. And today we'll get to David and Goliath, the actual fight, which, spoiler alert, it wasn't much of one. But. Dear Heavenly Father, just thank you for this morning's group. Just thank you for your word. And we're just thankful for the ability to worship in our country, the freedoms to come out every morning and hear your word and just fellowship together, Lord. I pray that you open up hearts and minds this morning. And again, our constant prayer is that through the book of 1 Samuel we'll grow, not only individually, but we'll grow collectively as a group as we fellowship together during these mornings and interact and just appreciate and enjoy the truths and the applications we get from this beautiful, wonderful book, Lord. So we're so thankful for your word and just thankful for your blessings to this group. And I pray that you'll give me the words this morning and the thoughts and spur and open up our minds to these things as we go through just about the rest of chapter 17. And I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So we'll do a little review. Again, get your mind ready to go. My little hot. Maybe a little bit. So we'll review. We like to do this so that you start to think about where we're at, where we left off last week. Start to think about those things and then move forward through the rest of the chapter, at least through to 53 today. So let's review to begin. So last week, if you recall, we began our study as Jesse, David's father, decided to send his son David to the battlefield at the Valley of Elah, which is located in the tribal territory of Judah. And we saw a map, indeed, if you could bring that map up. And a couple weeks ago, we established a map, and you see that's in southern Israel. And we see that the red X is where the Valley of Elah is. That is in the territory, a tribal territory of Judah. Now, the two armies met at this valley with the Philistines on one side up on a hill and Israel on the other side, both up holding high ground on either side of the valley. This is the setup. Now, Jesse's three sons had volunteered to fight for Saul. Saul had a standing army, but anytime there was trouble, he had volunteers also that came from the tribes, volunteered to help. And so Jesse's three sons were volunteers. They were now fighting, and they were at this battle. Now, because of this trouble with the Philistines, David was not currently in service to the king, who he would play the harp to settle Saul, who would have some mental disturbance at times, and that was David's job. But he was at home. He was tending his father's sheep in the hometown of Bethlehem. And we could see that Bethlehem is about 15 miles east of the battle. So if you travel straight east where the purple and the the purple and the blue line meet, that's where Bethlehem is. I don't know if you can see on the map. But Bethlehem is about 15 miles away. Now, it would be a day's journey for the young shepherd to travel over to the battle. Now, the purpose of the trip was threefold, more than likely in Jesse's mind. First, David was to deliver a care package to his brothers. And we talked about last week, we thought that the care package was probably a modern invention. But the care package is thousands of years old. And so Jesse was going to send some care package to his sons to this battle. A second reason that David's being sent is he was to deliver gifts to the boys' commander. Once again, we have another thing that we do usually traditionally is to take care of the people that take care of our children. So we send gifts to the teacher or, to the karate teacher, anybody in charge of our children. Even in the military, we do the same thing. Jesse's taking care of the commander of the boys. And so he's going to send some goodies to the commander as well. Probably thirdly and most importantly, Jesse wants David to bring back news of the battle and the health of his brothers. Of course, the only way he was going to get any information was through word of mouth. So David was to gather information and come back and let them know how the boys were doing, how the battle was going. Now, when David finally arrived at Elah, it was the time of day in which both armies positioned themselves in battle array. And this idea of battle array is there would be a certain amount of soldiers that would come down into the valley, and they would saber rattle. All right, they would move down, they would shout, and they would scream battle cries at each other. Now, this kind of posturing had been going on, we learned, from 40 days. Now, 40 days is repeated several times in the Bible and is usually a time period of trouble and testing, sometimes a time period of transition. And we see it many times in the Bible. Just as our Lord was tempted for 40 days in the wilderness, the flood rains came 40 days and 40 nights, right? Moses was on Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. So we have this repeat of 40, a time of testing, a time of trouble. So this has been going on for 40 days, but interestingly, on day one, as they formed battle array and they come down and they're yelling battle shouts at each other, the Philistines did something different this time. Out from the ranks walked an enormous warrior by the name of Goliath. Now he, along with his shield carrier, and there was a single man who carried his shield. That's how big the shield was. And so him and his shield carrier moved towards the battle lines of Israel, and when he got close, the soldiers of Israel shrunk back in fear. And he began to taunt and to challenge the army of Israel, cursing their God. Now, the central theme of his taunt, in other words, what was he saying repeatedly, generally, every single time he addressed Israel? Well, he would say the same thing. We don't need a bloody battle this day. We don't need to fight amongst ourselves. Just send out a man from your ranks to fight me one-on-one. The winner will decide who will become the slave of the other. Thus we save some lives and some bloodshed. David witnessed this whole process on day 40. And then he did what would happen in the army. He heard a bit of army scuttlebutt. Right? He heard some of the soldiers talking. King Saul, he learned, had offered a reward for a man who would volunteer to face Goliath and kill him. Now, David can hardly believe what he is hearing and seeing. To him, in his own minds, the soldiers should be lining up to fight Goliath, but there seems to be nobody. Now we get the heart of David. And this is why David is listed as a man after God's own heart, because we see where his heart, and we say this is not the seat of emotions. His heart was with God. His will, his volition, his mind, how he thought was lined up with God's own thoughts. So we get David's heart in his passage. He's not concerned, as Pastor Joe rightly pointed out, he's not concerned with reward. He isn't. Although this is part of the story. He is concerned with the reputation, the very name of God. It is being blasphemed by Goliath's taunt. And the fear displayed by his Israel brethren. They weren't representing God properly. They were shrinking in fear. So we hear this come out in David's question. He asks, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God? Now, the living God is translated as Elohim Kaim. It bothered David to the core that such a man would be allowed to babble on like this in such a blasphemous manner. So after making several other inquiries, he's asking questions of the soldiers, trying to figure out what this offer was and what's going on here. Some soldier or soldiers overhear David, and they reported this back to Saul. When Saul summoned David, David made it clear that he was volunteering to go out and fight Goliath. He'd already decided. And after Saul reacted negatively, basically, you can't go out. He looks at David, he's in his shepherd's garb, he's got no armor. You can't go out and fight. You're just a boy. David explained that Saul had nothing to worry about. David was used to defending sheep against strong predators such as lions and bears. Whenever one of them stole a sheep from the herd, well, David would pursue it and rescue the sheep. And whenever a lion or bear would turn on him to attack, he would grab it by its hair and kill it. And in David's mind, he would treat this Philistine warrior the same way. Basically, he'll grab Goliath by the scruff of his beard and slap him around and kill him. It's kind of funny back and forth. I can imagine what Saul was thinking in his head as this young boy is telling these things. But you see, his mental attitude was sound. Where he was spiritually was sound from all those days and nights depending on God for his protection when he was out with the sheep. God was his protector. God was Elohim Kaim, the living God. He was the controller of human history. He was with David wherever he went. Despite how his brethren had been treating Jehovah, the Lord was the army of Israel, with the army of Israel, and he would be with him in this fight with the Philistine. You see, he looked at his brethren, and he couldn't believe how they were acting. They were treating Elohim Kaim as if he was in heaven relieving himself or something. Maybe off sleeping, like other gods were accused of. To the Israelite mind, Elohim Kaim was definitely not with them. But David's mind wasn't that way. Despite Saul's better judgment, he decided to let David fight. And that's where we left off last week. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read verses 31 to 40. And you can turn in your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 17. If you do have the notes, you can turn to, where are we at? Page 1. Page 1 has 31 to 40. It's up to you. On page 1, I have it right here, or you could be in the Bible. But the reason why it's tricky is I'm going to read 31 to 40, but then I'm going to go to page 3. Good, somebody said page 3. The second to last paragraph, we're going to start there. All right? So I'm going to read 31 to 40, and then we'll be on for page 3 in the notes at the second to last paragraph. Good, everybody good? All right. Verse 31. When the words which David spoke were heard, they told them to Saul. Of course, somebody from his army, a group, went to Saul and said, you should hear what this kid's saying. And he, Saul, sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go up against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, while he has been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant was tending his father's sheep, and when a lion or bear came and took the lamb from this flock, I went out after him and attacked him and rescued it from his mouth. And when he rose up against me, I seized him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God, Elohim Kaim. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and may the Lord be with you. And Saul clothed David with his garments and put a bronze helmet on his head, and he clothed him with armor. David girded his sword over his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. So David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. And David took them off. Verse 40. He took his stick in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in the shepherd's bag, which he had, even in his pouch. And his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. So we ended last week as we saw that David's speech worked as Saul reluctantly let David fight for Israel. Now, why would he agree to such a thing? To set the stage of why Saul would agree. We talked a little bit about this last week, and I want you to think like Saul. There was something at stake for Saul here. He sends David out there, and of course he's not going to die, and neither was any of his trained soldiers. But what is he going to look like if he sends the shepherd boy out with no armor? He's killed within 2 minutes. And think about what Saul looks like. He looks like a fool. And so you got to understand that we're trying to think of why would Saul do this? Probably realizing that David was going to be defeated in short order. What is Saul thinking at this time? So there is something at stake. But it seems that Saul, right here, I want to think about, he's between a rock and a hard place, to use that expression. Things were not really going well. I mean, the Philistines didn't have the upper hand. Israel hadn't lost a soldier yet, and neither had the Philistines. But I think if you really look at the situation, this is not good, what is happening these 40 days. They were stuck in this stalemate for over a month. No arrow had been shot. And I asked the question in my paragraph, where was Jonathan when you needed him? And I think if Jonathan was active, he probably would have snuck across this valley at night and then would have attacked the Philistine camp at some point in time. I mean, something had to give here. See, they couldn't remain here indefinitely, and the longer they remained, I think it was the Philistine army who gained the upper hand. It's the Philistine army that had the advantage. Many of these men were volunteers who had crops to attend and other responsibilities at home. To simply sit idly day by day in the hills above the valley of Elah, hearing Goliath yell insults at them, this behavior had its limits. You can only do this for so long. And it seems that Saul understood this delicate balance. He couldn't stay here indefinitely. They were being mocked. He had a lot of volunteers in this army. How long was it going to be before they started sneaking off, just heading home? I mean, it happened in the past. We also look at Saul's indecisiveness. It seems that Saul isn't ready to go headlong into battle until he knows he's going to win. And so we have all these things kind of to look at as we decide, well, why would he send David out there? Well, something had to give. Saul was desperate, more than likely, and so he had nothing to lose. So what does he say? He says to David, go, and may the Lord be with you. Does that make sense about Saul and his thinking? Of course, I don't know exactly what his thinking must have been. But it seemed like he was desperate enough to send the shepherd boy out without armor, just go out there and see where the cards fall. But when he decided to let David go out there, of course, originally he wasn't going to send David out there defenseless, so he decided to give David his armor, which of course didn't fit and was rather restrictive. It was too bulky for the young shepherd. David couldn't move. What was the one advantage David had? We talked about. If he had one advantage, God was on his side. Well, physically, we all know that. But yes, thank you, Pastor George. Speed, if he had anything, speed. I mean, he had to be free of movement. And so he decided, you can't move in the armor. He was a dead duck at that point in time. So he would lose his speed. Now, I watched a video on the Valley of Elah. I watched a couple of videos. And there is a couple who found a brook that runs along the base of the hill of the traditional site on which the Israelite army stood. So there's a traditional site. I showed you the pictures a couple of weeks ago, the valley itself, where Israel was situated, where the Philistines were situated. And so they did a little, they're not archaeologists or anything, not professional, but they did a good job of going up to that area, traditional site, and looking around. And there happened to be a brook at the base of where Israel would have been. And if they are correct, what happened was David took Saul's armor off. Basically, I can't wear this. He bid Saul farewell. Then he walked down the hill to its base where there was a brook. With his shepherd's staff in his hand, he selected 5 smooth stones to place in his pouch. And with his shepherd's staff, his pouch, his sling, and all his shepherd's garments, not one piece of armor, David, with confident with a confident walk made his way toward Goliath. So what I want to do is I want to show you 5 minutes of that video so you can see it for yourselves, what the traditional site looks like, Valley of Elah, and what they find as they look and they find the brook, and you're going to see some of the smooth stones here. Again, they're not professional archaeologists or anything, but I wanted to just kind of see if you could get a nice visual as we picture David going out to meet Goliath. So go ahead, Deej.
Now that we have identified Sha'araim and understand where the Israelites have encamped, we can peek over the valley and look for the place where the Philistines gathered and where David and Goliath might have fought.
There it is.
So incredible! What a view!
Wow.
We can see everything, the whole Valley of Elah. Okay, I got goosebumps just thinking what transpired here. Can you imagine thousands upon thousands of Philistines right across there?
Yeah.
I mean, chanting.
Wow.
So cool. Okay, this is definitely a plausible location. Everything just checks out. Sha'araim, you got Sukkot right there, Azekah right there, and the Philistines would be right over those hills, and the Israelites would be here. Okay, we're so excited. Now we need to come down and make sense out of all of this.
Yeah.
To help us place the events in their proper location, we have called our friend and pastor Charlie Garrett from the Superior Word Church in Sarasota, who had been studying this biblical account in detail and examining each Hebrew word for the past 5 weeks. Do you think this would be fitting the account?
Oh, why not? I mean, you got that big empty spot in the middle where a battle would take place, hills on both sides where they would be encamped, so it perfectly fits the description.
This is incredible. I have goosebumps again just thinking this is where it all took place. Thank you so much for the help.
Love you guys.
Love you. Bye. So Charlie says this fits the biblical narrative, and he believes that this could be the spot. There is a Nahal down there, a river, and there is a ridge which would separate Philistines and the Israelites. So we're going to go down there and check if this could be the spot where they fought. I'm excited. Let's go.
Of course, this road wasn't there.
After October 7th, I've really been thinking a lot. I'm not there. I don't know your...
So we went around the valley, and now we're approaching the dirt road that...
Will lead us to the stream.
Yes,
right?
yes, that's what we saw right here. Oh.
Be careful.
Ooh. 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 Wow. Okay, this is it.
So they're driving towards where the Israelites would have been.
We're actually crossing the
right
valley.
through the center of the valley.
They could have been standing right here for
There it
as much
is.
as we know it. There it is.
There it is. Let's go and explore.
Yep. Ooh, it's hot.
Wow, this is so exciting. Can you imagine this is where David could have picked up his stone, the 5 smooth
I
stones?
think it's August.
I see plenty of smooth stones down there.
Yeah. Wow, this is the river.
Look how green it is. Probably because there's water underneath.
This is awesome. It's the beginning of August, and it's still green here. It means water runs here throughout the spring and winter time, and it's
Yeah.
enough to sustain this vegetation throughout the summer. That's pretty
Yeah.
cool. All right, so let's go into the stream and check out if we can find some smooth rocks. Wow.
Do you think this is where David would have stooped down and picked up a
Bunch
few
of
stones?
smooth rocks.
This has gotta be. I mean, look at them.
They, right?
There's so many. This is where the water runs, right here. And you can see that some of the earth is still like more brown, more moist, and
Yeah.
there's still vegetation growing here, which means this is exactly where the water runs in the wintertime, in the springtime, which is most likely the time when they actually attacked or when they went to battle.
In 2 Samuel chapter 11, the Bible mentions that it was the spring of the year when kings would go out to battle. Considering Israel's climate, this makes perfect sense. The summer can get extremely hot, autumn is the time to collect the harvest and prepare provisions for the winter, and the winter can get very rainy and relatively cold, making springtime to be the best option for war.
So it's very likely that when the Philistines came here, it was during springtime and the water would still be here. And it could be pretty bad because that's the majority of the stream comes here after winter. And it's plenty of water here, which makes
there
it
would
so
have
much
been
more
water
difficult
during the time
to
of the
cross,
battle
to attack,
in that
to
stream.
engage in war in this particular area.
But in this particular valley, springtime might not have been the best idea because the river would have been full of water, making this area very muddy and hard to cross. This would put the army who dared to attack first at a great disadvantage.
And this makes the biblical account so much more understandable. Think about it. If this is the river and it was water here, the first military, the first army to attack would be at a disadvantage. They would have to cross the river, and by the time they cross the river, they would have to climb and attack. The Israelites who would be on the mountain right there, and the archers would be right there at the top shooting at you. You're at disadvantage. So the first army to attack is a disadvantage.
This explains why neither army attacked each other for 40 days, and instead chose a one-on-one fight to resolve the war.
So you've got Philistines on the one side, the Israelites on the other side of the mountain, and neither wants to attack, and so going man versus man made a lot of sense.
And now that we've answered our first question, next we're going to pick up a few smooth stones from the riverbed and check if David's slingshot was a worthy weapon of war.
Okay, so
So we've built this DIY slingshot. It's very simple to build. It's made out of
the reason why we won't watch that is because these novice stone slingers are going to start to try to sling stones, and they're not really that good. Is he? Anyway, very neat and very interesting. Gives us a little visual there, and so you know, as we picture this, I want us to have that visual in our head. It's so important to set that up. So I thought you'd find that interesting. So page 4 of that, and we'll pick up. But I wanted you to see David going down, and it looks like he had covered the coverage of trees, going down and selecting his smooth stones. He would have gone right down to that brook that we saw. If that was the brook, it would have been full of water. Probably was the spring of the year, would have had plenty of stones that you see that he would have selected and put in his pouch, right? And he would have done that under cover. So you can see there's plenty of trees around. He wouldn't have been exposed. Goliath wouldn't have seen him, the armies of the Philistines. And you can see that separation, and I thought they made a good point of that stream, that river, providing a separation between the two armies. And maybe one of the reasons why it would have been very difficult for one army to attack the other. Rose has a question before you move on.
Yeah, if it was full of water, how would he have found the stones?
Well, there's stones on the banks too, Rose. I don't know how filled it would have been. Like, in other words, you know how they showed that raging river? So I don't know if it would have been that, like, raging. I'm sure it would have been low water, right, like a brook, and he might have been able to reach in there and grab. But I think there would have been stones on the side. Yeah, on the banks and stuff like that, yeah, I'm sure. But, you know, like I said, it might have been only a foot of water, even in its deepest anyway. So, any other questions before we move on? All right, good. Just like I said, I just want to give you that nice visual, because then next we're going to get to the fight. But I did want to take a brief detour. So we're going to take maybe a 5 to 10 minute detour of something I really want to speak about when we talk about David and his faith. It is actually the central theme of my lesson this morning that I want to talk to you about. So we're going to talk about what kind of faith it took for David to be so confident among what seems to be pretty much unsurmountable odds. Like, what kind of faith did it take? What was his faith like? So if this was given modern betting values, what odds would the odds makers have given David now? I'm not promoting any gambling this morning, but what odds would you say he would have been? A 100 to 1 underdog, a 500 to 1 underdog? I mean, what kind of odds would they have given this young boy with no armor facing this giant of a man? Battle tested. I mean, the odds would have been great, right? Obviously. Now, one of the greatest upsets in sports history was when Buster Douglas beat Mike Tyson for the heavyweight championship of the world. If anybody remembered watching that thing. Mike Tyson was a 42 to 1 favorite to win that match. And there probably wasn't anybody who gave Buster Douglas much of a chance. 42 to 1. And I would think that David's odds against Goliath would have been even more. But despite bad odds, David had what can best be described as a childlike faith. And I think it is one we should all seek to attain. And if we should seek to attain it, what is it? What exactly is this childlike faith that I speak of? And so I want to talk a little bit about that. Now, the first thing that we need to do is clarify the difference between, because we have the word child in there, is a childlike faith and a childish faith. You've heard pastors among the years who have talked about the difference between these two. Now, a childish faith would be one in which the believer's growth is in some way stunted. I mean, that believer isn't growing in any way. They're still a baby Christian. His or her faith would be marked by immaturity. Paul had this problem with certain members of the church in Corinth, right? Pastor George just did a great study in 1 Corinthians, and we've studied what this church was like and all the problems that they had. And a lot of their faith was childish in nature, like a childish faith. This is what Paul said about them. I gave you milk to drink, not solid food. In other words, he couldn't give them the greater, Christian doctrines because they weren't ready for it. He had to give them just basic things. So he gave them milk to drink, not solid food, for you are not able to receive it. Indeed, even now you are not able, for you are still fleshly. It's from 1 Corinthians 3. See, their childish faith was confirmed by Paul because they were acting fleshly. And we talked about that. There's fights and divisions, inappropriate taking of the Lord's Supper, dragging each other into a court, and like all kinds of sexual immorality going on. This behavior of theirs stunted their spiritual growth so that Paul could not teach them the greater concepts of Christian doctrine. They were like little children who needed a bottle. But he says to them, they should have been on solid food at this point in time. Picture a 10-year-old still taking a bottle. I'll give you even a more disgusting picture. Imagine a 10-year-old still drinking breast milk. That's disgusting. So take that picture. And that's what a childish faith looks like. A believer who should know better, who should be progressing in their faith, but they're still immature, and their behavior shows it. And so that's childish. And then we have, unfortunately, brothers and sisters in Christ who have a childish faith. Now, a childlike faith, on the other hand, is one marked by growing maturity. It is one that is powerful, but yet very simple in its concept. And I wanted to encourage you, a childlike faith doesn't mean that you are a learned scholar in the Bible and you've read the Bible 5 times back and forth. Of course, our maturity lots of times is based on practice and knowledge, but a childlike faith can be very simple, very powerful, and it can be upon a growing Christian who is continuing to grow, but hasn't been a Christian for many, many years. See, we're going to think about this word child and what a child is like, and it helps us understand what childlike means. See, think about a child. A child automatically is very trusting of adults in their life, aren't they? They are, what do we say, impressionable. The adults can leave their impression, their mark on many children. And the ones in your sphere of influence, your own children, of course, you can impress upon them many different things. So you fathers and mothers have great authority there, great influence with your children. They see you, they emulate you. You teach them a lot of different things. But a child automatically trusts you. Everything that mom or dad says, they believe. Everyone kind of knows this. So as a matter of fact, an adult could tell a child just about anything, and that child will believe them. Well, sometimes we do that to trick our child or just to have a little fun with them. But think about how trusting a child is. You tell them something, they believe it, as if it's gospel. Now, we would call this being gullible in a lot of ways. But this is not the beauty of a childlike faith. We apply this same idea of a child being so trusting and vulnerable, and we apply it to his or her faith in God, and now you have an amazing spiritual cocktail. A childlike faith is one in which the believer innocently just believes and trusts everything that God says, no matter how much overall knowledge they possess. They just trust God. When God is the adult that tells the children to trust him in everything, despite what the circumstances might show, and that child simply walks in that trust, this is a childlike faith. But, Lord, my circumstances, I don't even understand. I don't understand what you're doing. I don't understand what you're doing in the world. And then we panic and we fret. See, the child, like faith, is one that just trusts God. They know who and what God is, who he says he is. I'm just going to trust him. I'm going to move forward in faith. The childlike faith is simple. Adults make things more complicated, and sometimes this keeps them from the truth. This keeps them from growth. They just make things complicated. But children, lots of times, uncomplicate the whole matter. They just trust and believe the adults in their life. But when that is applied again to God, and they just take God, everything at face value, and they're just going to move forward in faith no matter what they see with their eyes and what their mind believes with what they're seeing, from what they're seeing. And this is childlike faith. This is important. Jesus was explaining the same concept to his disciples in Matthew 18. It says this, bottom of page 4. At that, the disciples came to Jesus and said, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" There you go, adults making things complicated. And of course, that's childish. All right, who's going to be better? Is it going to be me, or it's going to be John? Who's going to be great? Childish. They're acting childish. They're acting like children in a bad way. And Jesus was so wonderful, and he called a child to himself and set him before them. I picture Jesus motioning for a child, whoever's son or daughter, and just lovingly greeting them, sitting them down right in front of himself. And with the child sitting right in front of our Lord, he's now going to teach. This is what he says. "Truly I say to you, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, the one sitting before him, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." Jesus was not calling them to be childish, but rather to be childlike. That's the call. Be like a child. Be like this young child with an innocent, trusting attitude that whatever God says, they take at face value and they believe. I asked Ken if I could do this, but I'm going to put Ken on the spot. When Ken was recently in his darkest hour and was concerned that he was concerned that he might die. And for those of you who didn't know what happened to Ken, he had a heart attack and he could have died. And the Lord could have chose to take Ken. That's the Lord's choice. So Ken is in the hospital. It could go either way. But knowing Ken, he was okay. Because if the Lord took him, he'd be with the Lord. He was fine. But then Ken started to think about his children. He started to think about Kelsey and Corey, even Patty and Bilster Bob, and the responsibility he has to them. And so suddenly, over great concern for them, he cried out to his Lord, spare his life for the sake of his family. I know for a fact that Ken cried out to the Lord that night, not because he was concerned about the pain he was going to go through or death, because he knew he was going to meet the Lord. He was concerned about his family. And then it broke him down, and he was just like, no, Lord, please, please spare me. Kenny was no longer 69 years old, I can tell you that. Kenny was all of a sudden 5 years old. Kenny was all of a sudden 9 years old. He was 9 years old. Kenny will tell you that he became like a little child asking his Father in heaven to heal his body for the sake of others. Childlike faith. And I know that this is what Ken went through when he prayed to the Lord that night. And when we have faith like that, we become like little children. Why have I taken this detour? Why am I taking us down this road? I'm going to apply it to this passage. And it shows why David's mental attitude was totally different than everybody else's, all the grizzled warriors that he stood amongst. Because I believe that David's actions in this chapter were some of the greatest examples of a childlike faith. I believe that David had no doubt in his mind that he would beat the Goliath. When he decided to face a Goliath, it was done. I am convinced that it never entered his mind that he could lose or that bodily harm was a possibility. He was determined to silence this loudmouth Philistine that was hurling insults at his God. His innocent, childlike mind could not even comprehend why every single Israelite observing this whole debacle didn't feel the same way as he did and why they weren't lining up to fight Goliath. He couldn't understand. So when we put that in the context of the story, I believe David marched himself straight down that hill using that video we just watched. He went straight down that hill with a steady mind, reached the brook, selected the stones, then made his way toward Goliath without any thought that his death could actually be moments away. David was not down by the brook biting his fingernails, wondering what he got himself into. I wish I wouldn't have opened my big mouth. And now, because he was embarrassed, he had to go fight Goliath. It wouldn't even enter his mind. Of course he would have lost. This is an incredible example for us who have the Holy Spirit of God who dwells within us. We need to have this childlike faith in our lives. I mean, there's plenty of verses, but Philippians 4:13 came right to my mind. We can do anything through him who strengthens us. Nothing's impossible with God. And so I take this detour with you because I don't want us to think as we move on in the story that David had a worry in the world. He was going down, he was going to defeat Goliath, and it was the reason why amongst all these men, a young boy could go down and fight Goliath without any fear. It wasn't a complicated faith. It wasn't from years and years of study. He just loved God, he trusted God, he practiced his faith before out in the fields of Bethlehem, and now he was going to put that faith into practice here, right out in the battle of Elah here, right in this valley. And I think he marched right out to Goliath with no concerns. Verse 41. Well, before we go on, does anybody have any comments or anything else they want to say?
My question was, why did he take 5 stones?
All right, so Joe said, Doc Joe said if he was so confident, he would have taken 1. I would think that all the stone slingers would tell you, Joe, that no good stone slinger worth the salt would ever leave his pouch empty. So I think that one of the reasons might have been you always took 5 stones or you always took multiple stones when you went out to fight battle. But Mary had an interesting comment last week that maybe the 5 stones represented the 5 lords of the Philistines, 1 for each lord, in a symbolic gesture. So that could possibly be it. But the real answer is, I actually don't know. We're not told. So I'm not sure why he took exactly 5 stones, but they're good guess as any.
Saul had 4 brothers. So David was thinking that Goliath had 4 brothers, that they might have come to avenge Goliath.
That could be it,
David
but
was
but the brothers aren't on the battlefield, so we. Well, we don't know that, but we don't know that. I mean, we don't know any of that. So I mean, that's a good guess as any. Yeah, 4 brothers plus him. Mary.
Well, in a spiritual way, we could take it as representing the giants in our life, because in 2 Samuel, I think it's 21, verse 22, I believe, it says that when David was telling about the defeat that his men had over the Philistines and others, he mentioned descendants of Gath, and there were 4 that they killed. The descendants from the giants, that there were 4 that were specifically killed,
Right.
which would have been, if you took Goliath, those 4. I mean, it just could be like a spiritual representation,
Absolutely.
in other words.
Absolutely. I mean, all of it's speculation. We could make a good educated guess, but I'm not really sure. It doesn't tell us why he selected 5 smooth stones. Either all of them made sense. There could be a spiritual reason, obviously, representing something there. The 5 lords of the Philistines, the 4 brothers plus Goliath, sounds good to me, and we're not really sure. I definitely don't think it was a matter of not having faith, being worried that the first stone was going to miss. We're going to talk a little bit about the stone slingers in a second, but they were pretty good, and I think that sounds like David was really, really good. All right, any other questions as far as the battle goes? 41 to 53, page 5. I'll just read those 13 verses. Then the Philistines came on and approached David. Then the Philistine came on and approached David with the shield bearer in front of him. So the old man, the one single man is holding a Goliath's shield. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy and with a handsome appearance. The Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine also said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field." And David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of Jehovah Zebaot, the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. And I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." Then it happened when the Philistine rose and came and drew near to meet David, that David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand into his bag and took from it a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. And the stone sank into his forehead, so he fell on his face to the ground. Thus David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him, but there was no sword in David's hand. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. The men of Israel and Judah rose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the slain Philistines lay along the way to Sha'araim, even to Gath and Ekron. The sons of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines and plundered their camps, which is the place we are going to end in chapter 17 today. So David is approaching Goliath, and Goliath sees this young man with no armor, wearing only his shepherd's garments, and you can imagine he's offended. He can't believe that he has been challenging Israel to send out their best warrior for 40 days, and this is who they finally sent out against him. And he says out loud, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" The Goliath was both insulted, we can understand, and infuriated. And in his own mind, this Israelite did not represent an honorable challenge. And not to say that Goliath was honorable, but he is a warrior. Warriors fight warriors. He's insulted. This is who they send out? This is no challenge to me. So he cursed David, invoking his God, and promised to feed him to the birds. Now, this does have meanings. In other words, he wouldn't allow David a proper burial, which was a horrible insult and indignity at this time. So what he's promised is to kill David and not allow him to be buried. Of course, David has this beautiful faith-filled retort that what Goliath doesn't realize is that this is not just a physical battle, but a spiritual one as well. He alerts Goliath that basically he made a big mistake when he taunted his God, Yehovah Zevaot, the Lord of hosts. Yehovah Zevaot. It was his God who would give him the victory today. And since this battle was public, all would know whose God reigns supreme. It's our God, the true and living, who would be victorious today. And he tells Goliath this. The evidence, a boy with no sword, spear, or armor, or javelin, he says, will strike you down and remove your head from you, and I, he, will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth. You can imagine this statement must have further infuriated the big Philistine who came towards David to finish him off. And then we read that David hurries himself towards Goliath. And he's rushing towards Goliath. Now, in case you think this story is kind of impossible, of course, I know that you guys have a great faith and know the Bible is true. But in case you say, well, I don't know about this slinging stones thing, let me inform you that a sling is no child's toy. And I know that Hasbro or maybe Milton Bradley at some point in time made a little child sling, a little plastic one, and something like that. I mean, they're always making these little toys. But a sling was a respected weapon at this time, a real serious weapon. It wasn't no child's toy. Armies of this era often employed entire divisions of stone slingers as a deadly and effective tactic, just as archers are employed in other areas. And there might have even been archers as well. We talked about it in the video. But you would have had stone slingers. It would have been divisions of them as well to help. So this is a serious weapon. Now, Judges 20:16 tells us of a division of 700 Benjamites who were left-handed stone slingers. They were left-handed as well. A lot of the Benjamites had a personal characteristic of being left-handed. It says this, out of all these people, 700 choice men were left-handed, and each one could sling a stone, listen to this, at a hair and not miss. So not only was it a deadly weapon, it could be an accurate weapon. You see somebody doing this and the stone goes, who knows where it's going to go. These guys could hit a hair at distance and not miss. So this is a serious weapon with deadly accuracy if you knew how to do it. And obviously, David knew how to operate this weapon. Plenty of practice. The young shepherd loads a serious weapon and hurls the first stone at basically an unprepared Goliath, striking him in the one place he has no protection. We talked about Goliath. He's armored up. He's got armor everywhere. Now, if the stone strikes him anywhere besides his face, it's going to hurt. Maybe some places it will bounce off the armor. But if it doesn't land to its mark, it's going to just anger the big Philistine. He's going to be that much more angry. The only place that's vulnerable is his face, his forehead, too. So it hits him in the one place he has no protection, and it knocks him unconscious. Verse 49 gives us a detail that I think has great significance, right? Goliath falls on the ground, and when he fell on his face to the ground. So the stone hits him, he falls forward, face down. Then David ran up and grabbed Goliath's own sword and removed his head. And there's a couple different thoughts there. The stone could have knocked Goliath out, and then David finished him off. The stone could have killed Goliath if he was left to lay on the face down long enough, but David was going to lop off his head anyway. As part of the battle, we'll talk about that next week. Or the stone knocked him unconscious. David was just making sure that he was dead. It doesn't really matter. But I want you to see how when Goliath fell and David removed his head, that it brings up an old story from 1 Samuel chapter 5. Did this set of actions evoke any memories? Let me read 1 Samuel 5, verses 1 through 4, if you remember this part of our study. 1 Samuel 5. Now the Philistines took the ark of God. Remember they took the ark? And brought it from Ebenezer, that's the battlefield, to Ashdod. Then the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it to the house of Dagon, or Dagon, and set it by Dagon. And when the Ashdodites arose the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. Now listen what happens next. And they set him up, they dusted him off, set him back in his place. So they took Dagon, set him in his place again. But when they arose early the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen with his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. And the head of Dagon and both of the palms of his hands were cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. The meaning should not have been lost on either side. It probably was, as Goliath falls face down and David lops off his head, and now just the trunk exists on Goliath. As before, Dagon represented Goliath, has fallen into a place of submission before Jehovah, represented by David. Then, as Dagon before, Goliath's head was removed, leaving only his trunk. And there seems a repeat here of what happened years before. See, the Lord, the God of Israel, was showing that he was more powerful than any Philistine god. Once again, just like he did in their temple years before. And I think that shouldn't be lost on us, even if it's lost on them. Goliath fell into a place of submission. And so did all the Philistine gods before the Hebrew God, the Lord Jehovah. Now, seeing that their champion had fallen and that this Hebrew God was once again working against them, the Philistine army fled west in a panic. And similar to the other battles, all the Israelite army had to do was pursue a fleeing and panic-stricken army. Now, we end our section with the author telling us that the Israelite army pursued the Philistines as far as the two closest cities of the Pentapolis, Gath and Ekron. And DJ, if you could bring that other, I think I have it on that map, not that one. Do I have the other one? I don't know if you can see it. Can you see Ekron and Gath? You see the green lines? Yeah. So from the red X all the way over to those two cities, the Israelite army began to cut down this panic-stricken enemy as they fled back to their cities. Now we end our section with the author telling us that the Israelite army pursued the Philistines to Gath and Ekron, probably didn't enter into the city, and when they entered into the safety of the city, they turned around, they returned east, and they took spoil from the Philistine campsites as they moved their way back. It's basically what verse 53 tells us. Now, we did run out of time, but I would ask, does anybody have any questions or any comments about the end of this? I went a little long today, sorry. Paul Chubb.
Because God was involved, I don't believe that Saul had the ability to stop David from going up against Goliath. God would have stopped Saul from intervening.
Of course, because this was in the divine plan beforehand, that David was going to face Goliath, right? Provide this great example for us and give Israel, in time, the victory over the Philistines. So, yes, I agree with you on that. Pastor George.
Whatever God puts in your hand and he helps you to learn how to use it, the gift that he has given you, that's what he's going to produce the victory in your life with. For David, he learned how to have victory over the bear and the lion with the sling and the stone. So when it came for the battle, he was practiced in using that gift and ability.
Right.
God gives us all gifts and abilities. And how do we know what our gift is? We start practicing. We start serving the Lord. And God shows us where we are gifted And if we continue to live in that area where we're gifted and continue to practice it, God's going to bring his blessing out of it.
Great application, Pastor George. Thank you. Yeah, we can see that application. That's good. Yep. David had to apply what he learned in the fields of Bethlehem. And he applied it in a valley 15 miles away against a formidable foe, right? A giant, Goliath.
Thank you. I appreciate Paul bringing up that point because I've been meditating on that also. I think we give too much credit to our free will when really it's much more limited than we think. So I see God, directing the situation like that precisely, in our own lives today.
That's right.
So I appreciate him bringing it up.
I always preach, and I think the pastors here always preach, that there is a balance between free will, right, and the divine plan. There's a balance there. If you sway too far to one side or the other, I think you're in error. So if it's all about God's sovereignty and no free will, then that's a problem. If it's all about free will and there's no God's sovereignty, that's a problem. So you got to be balanced. Of course, the divine plan, but the divine plan is going to happen. It's going to happen no matter what. But sometimes God takes choices that we make, and it's part of the divine plan. Our free will, our choices are part of the divine plan. It all works together.
I certainly also appreciate that point Pastor George brought up too.
No, that was a great point. It's a great application. All right, we do got to get going because it's 35. So thank you for your kind attention. Thank you for sitting for 5 extra minutes. Of course, there's plenty of other applications we have. We'll talk a little bit more about that kind of stuff next week. And thank you for everything that you guys do, coming in here early morning, 8:30, and really adding to this great study. So thank you guys. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, so many applications from this one chapter and this one event, David and Goliath, the story of legend, the great children's story, and even the story for adults. We love this story. Help us to apply these things. Help us to be willing to have a childlike faith. We're trusting our Father in heaven that what he says, we believe. No matter what we can see with our eyes, no matter what circumstances we find ourselves in, that we just trust you. We trust your word. We trust your character as revealed by your scripture. Who you are means something to us, and we can depend on you. So help us to have that childlike faith. Help us to apply it in our lives through difficulties. Ken was just through a difficulty recently. He had to apply that kind of a faith, a very, very important faith. And so help us to be like David, just willing to go out there and fight Goliath. Help us to be, as Pastor George talked about, practicing our faith, practicing and our service, and then putting that, or learning and practicing, and then putting it into, or employing it in our lives, Lord. And so there's very, very important applications, Lord. Help us to be Bible students in that way. Help us to continue to grow through the learning of your word. And I pray